Hey everyone, this is Kathrin Shaffer from Unpolished but Called. Today we're going to talk about one of my books, The King's Wisdom, and how it got started. So when I look back at how it got started, how it came to be, it still makes me shake my head and laugh a little. Mostly because I was the least likely person to write a book about leadership, and even less likely to write one about biblical leadership. If you told me a few years ago that I'd one day be sitting here talking to you about how God called me to write, I probably would have laughed and said, sure, okay, and gone back to my spreadsheets. The funny thing is, the whole thing started with a phone call. Nothing dramatic, just a regular conversation between two managers in my industry. We were catching up on work, the kind of talk where you trade updates, complain about reports, maybe talk about how many emails you're ignoring that day. And right in the middle of that ordinary call, my coworker said something that stopped me cold. He said, you should really write a leadership book someday. Real casual. Of course, I laughed hard. Like, that's funniest thing I've heard all week kind of laugh. The idea was ridiculous. Write a leadership book? Me? The girl who barely had time to eat lunch some days? I said, yeah, right. Maybe one day when I retire and have something profound to say. We both laughed, changed the subject, and that was that. End of conversation. But the thing about God is, he has a way of turning a passing comment into a calling sometimes. So at the time, I didn't think twice about it. I wasn't walking with Jesus then. I had no idea that he was already setting up something that would change my life. It would be another year and a half before I'd give my life to Christ, and another few months after that before I'd even begin to understand that whisper in my heart that wouldn't leave me alone. So we're going to fast forward 18 months ago. I started following Jesus, and everything in my life felt brand new, like learning how to walk again, only this time with someone actually guiding my steps. Still figuring out how to pray, how to read my Bible, how to trust God with things I'd spent my whole life trying to control. And then one night, I woke up. Not because of a noise or a nightmare, just awake. Probably around 2 in the morning, and there was this quiet sense in my spirit that I needed to write. Not a feeling, not a thought, but a pull whisper. I rolled over, muttered something about how I needed more sleep, and I went back to bed. Next night, same thing. Wide awake, same nudge, same whisper, right. I'm going to be honest. This time I argued. Lord, don't know if this is you, but I don't even know what to write. And you've got the wrong person. I'm not a theologian. I'm barely figuring out Genesis without getting lost. And silence. And if you've ever experienced that kind of silence from God, you know it's not absence, it's persistence. So by the third night, when it came again, this time I gave in. Not because I felt qualified, but because I just wanted to sleep again. So I got up, grabbed my notebook, went into the living room, sat down, and I started to write. And I started to write at the top, King's Wisdom. Don't know why. Just felt like that's what it should be called. And that's how it started. Not with ambition, not with plan, no clue where I was going, but just obedience. Absolute no clue what I was doing. Just knew I couldn't shake the feeling that this was what God wanted me to do. So I wrote. Early mornings before work, evenings when I should have been relaxing, weekends when everyone else was doing normal things. I was texted typing in my car. I was at work during breaks. You name it. It became the sacred rhythm. Work, write, pray, repeat. And something shifted in me. I started realizing that God wasn't just asking me to write a book, He was teaching me how to listen. Every time I sat down to type, it felt like He was peeling back layers, showing me things about leadership. Yes, but more importantly, about myself. Because before I could write anything that would help someone else lead better, God had to teach me how to follow Him. I used to think leadership was about being in control, about knowing what to do and getting it done. But the more I wrote, the more I realized real leadership looks like surrender. And that's exactly what He was doing in me. And there were nights I sat in front of that laptop, staring at the blinking cursor like it was mocking me. And I'd whisper, "Lord, I don't have the words." And somehow He'd give them, not all at once, but enough for that day, enough to keep going. Obedience became the only outline I needed. I remember one particular long night. I'd worked all day, made dinner, cleaned up, and I finally sat down to write. I was tired, overwhelmed, and wondering what I'd gotten myself into. Why me? I asked out loud. Why not someone who actually knows what they're doing? And as clear as anything I'd ever felt, I sensed God say, "Because you'll give me the glory when it's done." Oof. And that broke me because He was right. I knew that if this book ever saw the light of day, there'd be no doubt who made it possible. And that became my quiet mantra, for His glory, not mine. So I kept going. There were moments of joy, those rare nights when the words flowed easily and I could feel His presence so strong it would make me cry. And there were nights of doubts where I questioned every sentence and wondered if I'd made the whole thing up. But even in the silence, He was shaping something in me: patience, discipline, and trust. I started to realize that the King's wisdom wasn't just about leadership, it was about obedience. It was about learning to hear God's voice and respond even when you don't feel ready. And I had no idea what would come of it. I just knew I couldn't not write it. When I finally finished, I remember the moment vividly. Sitting there in front of my laptop, hands shaking, tears in my eyes, and I whispered, "It's done." And for the first time, I felt deep, still peace. The kind that only comes from doing what God asks of you. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was faithful. And that's the lesson God keeps teaching me. He's not looking for perfect vessels. He's not looking for willing ones. And when I hit publish on the King's Wisdom, I thought I was closing a chapter. But what I didn't know was that it was actually the beginning of everything. That book wasn't just a project, it was a promise. Proof that when God calls you, He equips you, even when you doubt it every step of the way. That phone call, that laugh, that late night whisper, they all became part of a story that only God could have written. But when I look back now, I can see how the King's Wisdom was never really about the book. It was about the breaking, the becoming, the quiet kind of transformation that happens when you finally stop running from the thing God keeps calling you toward. Finishing that manuscript didn't feel like crossing a finish line. It felt like opening a door. Up until that point, I'd spent most of my adult life trying to prove myself. In work, in leadership, in life. You hustle, you build a name, you meet expectations. But what happens when God asks you to do something you can't take credit for? That's what writing the King's Wisdom did for me. It stripped away the illusion that I was ever in control. I didn't have the qualifications, the credentials, or the confidence. But what I did have was a yes. And sometimes that's all God needs. One surrendered yes. And when I held that first printed copy in my hands, I didn't feel proud. I felt humbled because I knew exactly what it cost. Every late night, every moment of doubt, every time I wanted to quit and didn't, I could see his fingerprints all over it. But what I didn't realize at the time was that obedience to that one whisper will open up a whole new chapter of purpose. That's the thing about saying yes to God. It rarely ends where you think it will. After The King's Wisdom was published, I started hearing from people, messages, um, people I spoke to who saw themselves in my story, or who had somehow found the book or stumbled across it. But the thing that they all said were the same. It came at the exact time they needed it. And I remember sitting there reading those messages thinking, that's the Holy Spirit. Because I couldn't have orchestrated that if I tried. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about a book anymore. It was ministry. Not the kind of ministry that happens behind a pulpit, but the kind that happens behind a laptop, between the lines of ordinary obedience. See, the King's Wisdom taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. When you trust God with your little, He'll use it for something far bigger than you can imagine. That book became the foundation of what I now know as Unpolished but Called. It was the start of learning how to show up authentically, to write, speak, and live without pretending to have it all together. Because the truth is, I'm still learning. I'm still figuring it out, what it means to follow Jesus while balancing work, family, and calling. I'm still growing, still stumbling, still needing grace daily. But the King's Wisdom taught me that God can work with that. He doesn't need perfection. He just needs presence. It's strange how you can write something and not realize until later that God was writing it through you to prepare you for the next season. And that's what he did with me. That book built a kind of quiet confidence, not in my ability, but in his consistency. Because even now, when I start to doubt myself or question what I'm doing, I think back to that moment, sitting at my table, laptop open, whispering, Lord, I don't know how to do this. And he reminds me, you didn't then either, but you did it anyways. That's faith, not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And I think that's what God's been teaching me ever since. That calling doesn't come with clarity first. It comes with obedience. You don't need to have a 5-year plan. You just need to take the next faithful step. When people ask how I got started writing, I always smile because I know they're expecting some polished answer, something like, I always dreamed of being an author. But no, it was much messier than that. It started with insomnia and a whisper. It started with a phone call I laughed off. It started with a lot of, Lord, are you sure about this? And yet, somehow, here we are. The King's Wisdom became more than my first book. It became a symbol of how God redeems time, how he can take all the years you thought were wasted, all the skills you thought were secular, and use them for something sacred. Every leadership experience I'd ever had, every long shift, every difficult conversation, every lesson learned in the workplace, all of it found its place in his story. God didn't throw away my past, he repurposed it. And that's what I love most about him. He doesn't need us to start over. He just needs us to start obeying. Because once I said yes to writing that first book, it was like floodgates opened. Ideas, inspiration, new direction, all of it started coming. Not from striving, but from surrender. When you walk in obedience, creativity becomes worship. Every time I sat down to write after that, I wasn't just typing words. I was testifying to a God who takes ordinary people and uses them in extraordinary ways. And I know that some of you listening today might feel a tug like that. Something God's been whispering to your heart, maybe for weeks or even years. It might not make sense. It might feel inconvenient, but I promise you, obedience on the other side of uncertainty is where the miracles are. If I'd kept saying no, if I'd ignored those whispers, none of this would exist. Unpolished but Called wouldn't exist. My other books wouldn't exist. This podcast wouldn't exist. Because that first yet set everything else in motion. And I think sometimes we underestimate how powerful one obedient act can be. You might think it's small, a phone call, a conversation, a late night nudge to write or pray or forgive someone. But in God's hands, it's a seed to grow into things you could never predict. And that's exactly what happened with the King's Wisdom. It grew into something I didn't even know was possible. It taught me that God's purpose doesn't always come wrapped in confidence. Sometimes it comes disguised as discomfort. It doesn't start when we feel ready. It starts when we finally surrender. I remember sitting one morning after publishing, sipping my peppermint tea and feeling this strange combination of peace and purpose. Like for the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anything. I wasn't trying to prove myself. I was just where I was supposed to be. And that's when it hit me. Obedience doesn't just change what you do, it changes who you become. That book wasn't about leading others anymore. It was about letting God lead me. And He's still leading me. Sometimes through quiet seasons, sometimes through chaos, sometimes through unexpected blessings. But every single time it starts with a whisper. If the King's Wisdom taught me anything, it's this. You don't need a platform to start walking in purpose. You just need a posture, a heart that says, "Here I am, Lord," because that's where calling begins. And maybe that's what I want this episode to leave you with. The reminder that you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't need credentials, experience, or perfect timing. You just need to be willing to trust that when God says write, you'll write. When He says move, you'll move. When He says wait, you'll wait. Because obedience isn't about outcomes, it's about alignment. And I'll tell you something. There's a special kind of peace that comes when you finally stop arguing with God and just say yes. That peace carried me through every page of the King's Wisdom. And it's carried me into every book, every podcast episode, every conversation since. It still amazes me that what started as a random phone call turned into my first published book and then into a whole ministry that reaches people I'll probably never meet this side of heaven. But that's what God does with obedience. He multiplies it. He takes our small yes and turns it into something eternal. So, if you've been doubting whether God could use you, let this be your confirmation. He can. He already has a plan. You just need to take the first step. Thanks for spending this time with me today on Unpolished but Called. If this story encouraged you, don't forget to hit follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. You can find The King's Wisdom, my other books, and free resources at kathrinshaffer.com, all created to help you grow in faith, purpose, and obedience. And remember, obedience isn't about perfection, it's about participation. God doesn't need your polish, He just wants your yes. So until next time, keep walking in wisdom and keep trusting the King who writes better stories than we ever could.